Bathwack Creek Long and 2, 14 a.m. The four-man ambush team of Company 307 lay flat along the creek's edge, waiting for the American patrol boat that usually passed at dawn. The engine noise rolled in from afar, heavy steady, but oddly slow. Bob then signaled for absolute silence. As the sound drew closer, the whole team exchanged uneasy looks, no propeller churn, no wake, as if the boat were gliding over the water. Bob then pressed his ear to the muddy bank. He caught only a long metallic ray, unlike anything mechanical they'd heard before. A few seconds later, the engine noise vanished. The team shot upright, thinking the craft had entered range. But the water ahead was perfectly smooth. No swirl, no oil trace, as if nothing had passed at all. The internal report the next morning recorded a single line, Route 44A. The opposing force has a new mechanism under the hull. Reassess all attack plans. Vàm Cỏ Đông Creek, end of the 1968 rainy season. The water was pitch black, thick with the smell of mud and rotting leaves. On both banks, mangrove roots hung down like iron hooks. Beneath them was a swamp graveyard, a place where anything could be hidden: drum mines, sharpened stakes, even homemade explosive baskets. On this creek, two completely opposite doctrines clashed. The U.S. Riverine force relied on armor engines, firepower, mechanical advantage. Local guerrillas relied on terrain, mud, murky water, and crude but brutally effective traps. One side solved problems with technology, the other solved them with the environment. Every engagement on the creek was a test. Whoever adapted faster survived. That morning, Task Group 116.7. An ATC, a monitor, and 3 PBRs moved into an S-shaped bend. ATC 12 took the lead. The water was strangely calm. No swirl, no foam. Chief Marcus Hale stood on deck, tapping a wrench against the railing. The dull echo from below made him frown. Something was down there. ATC 12 drifted a little farther when the surface suddenly thumped upward. Hale yelled, "Mine under a drum charge," detonated beneath the hull, tearing open the port side and throwing crewmen into the water. The bow sank into a pre-dug mud trap. The monitor was snagged by mangrove roots. Moments later, a shoulder-fired tube round skimmed the surface and struck the side box, splintering armor and cutting into a crewman's shoulder. The PBRs tried to rush in, but were blocked by submerged stakes. Fire from the mangroves rained down. The formation was locked in place, no way forward, no way back. When ATC 12 was finally hauled out 20 minutes later, 3 men lay still and 2 were badly hurt. The bow plate was bent upward, the deck nails had popped, and black water seeped through every seam. Hale examined a broken armor panel. The blast had come straight up through the ATC's blind spot. Mercer stepped in, his voice heavy. "Mud holds the bow. Water hides the charge." A shot skims the surface. This whole creek is one complete trap. Hale stared at the black water that had just swallowed the craft and said hoarsely, "Water doesn't kill. It's what they hide under it." He knew if the patrol had to return to this route tomorrow, more men would die unless they built an entirely new kind of protection for this water war. A race had just begun. Floating Workshop, number 3, RAS 11. ATC 12 had just been hauled onto the dock. Black water dripped off in slow beads, but the main smell was no longer mud. It was a mix of burnt fuel, hot rubber, and freshly torn steel. The air inside the hull felt like furnace heat, carrying a scorched odor even harsher than the creek mud outside. Hale stood before the large breach on the port side. The armor had been ripped into a curved strip, like the lid of an ammo can bent backward. He slid his hand along the warm metal edge, feeling the steel still radiating heat from the blast under the creek. From the cut pattern, Hale determined the explosion had come from below. A drum mine planted right on the bottom, triggered by a pull cord from the bank. Inside the compartment, thick foul mud had settled everywhere. The recovery crew had to scoop it out by the bucket. Jammed between the prop blades was a broken bamboo stake proof. The stakes had been driven in at an angle to hold the boat in place after the blast. On the cabin roof, a charred patch marked where a launcher round had struck once the craft was stuck. Everything had been designed to freeze the ATC in place and finish it off. Hale knew that if the Riverine group had to pass that bend again, the next morning, things would be worse. Rain was coming, the mud would churn up, the water would turn cloudier, and the mines would be even harder to detect. Recon reports said the creek hadn't been swept in 2 days. There was no night mine team, and tomorrow's 00530 patrol would be going in completely blind. They had no time left, only 18 hours. Hale requested anything they could salvage: straight steel for bending into bar armor, old cable for a mine mesh curved armor plates from wrecked boats for a bottom shield, and the frame of monitor number 7, if it hadn't been stripped yet. Most of it was scrap, but it was all they had. Mercer gave Hale 6 men and full control of the floating workshop. Outside, crews worked on engines, replaced date cord, and prepared for a mission everyone knew they might not return from. Riverine countermeasure, Phase 1 underway. In the darkness of the floating workshop and the black water outside, hiding countless charges, Creekside villagers told American scouts that the night before, they'd heard an ATC passing through engines sputtering and armor scraping along the bottom like a boat about to fall apart, but still forcing its way forward. They gave it a rough nickname, the iron boat that knows how to dive. A small rumor, but the Riverine Navy knew that rumors in this region spread fast. RAS-11 floating. Workshop 1940. The dim yellow lights washed over ATC-12's hull, still streaked with oil and mud. Hale gathered 6 technical men around him, welders, mechanics, and electrician, and 2 monitor crewmen who had lost friends in last week's blast. All of them were dusted with steel grit and the lingering smell of gunpowder. Hale slapped his hand against ATC-12's armor plate. They had only 10 hours left and nothing but scrap to save tomorrow's patrol. He spread a rough sketch on an ammo crate and began 1. Mine screen, steel, mesh, and helicopter cable were dragged out of the scrapyard. The mesh would be mounted on the bow to sweep the bottom and catch trigger wires, even if it meant sacrificing 20% of their speed. Luke cut the cable and tied wooden floats to keep the screen at the right depth. 2. Angled bar armor. From burned-out ATC frames, they built armor plates slanted at 35 degrees to deflect launcher blasts down into the water. Hale calculated the angle based on the morning's damage and showed the team how to weld the inner supports. 3. Mud skid curved armor from old wrecks was reshaped into 2 steel scales set under the hull, helping the ATC slide across mud traps instead of being sucked in. Fox crawled underneath to hammer them into shape while Brooks drilled bolt holes. 4. Low gun mount. Using a 105mm gun brace and a door hinge, they improvised a pivot that let the M60 fire at positions right above the waterline. The crew split up and threw themselves into the work. The bar armor stood rough but solid. The mud skid bolted to the hull made the boat shudder like it was waking up. The mine screen cable was heavy, the wooden floats soaked up water, and the lines whipped at the monitor crewmen's hands, but they kept going. Near dawn, the entire system was finally installed. ATC-12 sat motionless beneath the weak yellow lights, its steel frame still warm, weld seams ticking as they cooled. Looks no longer mattered. All that mattered was checking one last time that it could survive a second run. ATC-12 floated quietly patched together, ready for the next sortie. In the Riverine force, the boundary between combat troops and technical crew barely existed. The man carrying an M60 in the afternoon could be swinging a welding hammer at night, and that rapid overnight adaptation was something the opposing side could not counter. Local guerrillas might excel at laying traps, but they couldn't turn a ripped-open boat into a new combat prototype in a single night. That was the Riverine's real advantage, responding with tactics and reshaping their equipment in the very middle of the battlefield. The test canal east of RAS-11 lay pitch dark under the mangrove shadows. On ATC-12's deck, Hale and the technical crew stood ready, welders, hammers wiring, and the mine screen already strapped to the bow. Everyone waited in silence for the order. Mine test. PBR number 3 pulled the screen tight ahead of the bow. The prop wash surged hard, and a sudden tug came from below. The training charge detonated right on the screen, a column of gray water shooting up 3 meters ahead. ATC shook violently, but didn't breach the mine screen, had caught it exactly where it should. Launcher test. A small boat fired a training round at a mock position barely above the waterline. The impact struck the 35-degree bar armor. The blast washed downward at an angle, leaving only a shallow dent. Hale noted that the welds needed reinforcing. Mud trap test. A thick mud bed had been dug into the bottom. ATC drifted in and sagged immediately. The mud skid engaged the two steel scales, lifting the hull just enough to slide across the edge of the trap. ATC jolted upward and cleared it. Low gun test. The gunner depressed the M60 20 degrees. The burst ripped across the water's surface, tearing apart a sandbag, simulating a near-bank firing point. Every feature worked, but the weaknesses showed. The hull vibrated hard. A few weld seams cracked the mud. Skid overloaded the engine, the mine screen cut the speed significantly, and it even began to drift toward the starboard prop, a serious hazard. As the team debated fixes, Caldwell arrived and pointed out that the entire setup exceeded limits, was overweight, and would be dangerous to bring into real combat. But tomorrow's Riverine run had no other option. Hale ended it briefly. The tests were complete. Now they had 7 hours to patch and reinforce every weak point. Under the weak yellow lights of the floating workshop, ATC-12 was pulled in again, bent rattling, but still the only hope before that Black Creek swallowed another patrol. Early morning, a civilian scout team returned to RAS-11 with scattered comments from Creekside residents. Word is the American boat drags iron under the water now. Tripwire mines blow too early and miss the hull. People are telling each other, don't fire close to the water. The new boat has a steel snout. 05:22 a.m. The Vàm Cỏ Đông Creek lay under a gray mist, the water thick and unusually still. The Riverine formation moved in combat order, monitor in front, ATC-12 in the center, PBRs covering the flanks. No one said a word. Hale stood at ATC-12's bow, his hand resting on the mine screen patched together from scorched cable. Ugly heavy, but the only protection they had. Mercer reported quickly that higher command had rejected the design, but the decision was theirs now, and they had to push through like it or not. The formation entered the exact bend where ATC-12 had been hit the day before. Silt hung just beneath the surface, hiding the creek bottom entirely. Hale ordered the mine screen lowered. The mesh slid down and stretched out ahead of the bow. Seconds later, impact. The mine screen struck a tripwire. A drum charge detonated right on the mesh, a gray water column surging up 3 meters forward. The steel frame bent, but the blast redirected downward into the mud, never breaching the hull. To the right, bubbles suddenly surged up. A launcher round skimmed the waterline. The angled bar armor caught the hit cleanly and shoved the pressure wave sideways, leaving only a swirling mark on the surface. The forward monitor was being sucked into thick mud and slowed sharply. ATC-12 began to sag. Hale recognized the signs of a hand-dug mud trap. The mud skid dropped, separating the hull from the suction and pulling ATC-12 over the lip of the pit. Follow-up fire came instantly. Automatic bursts from the bank low-angle launcher fire. The gunner dropped the improvised low mount nearly flush with the deck. The M60 burst tore through the shoreline emplacement, neutralizing the firing point. In exactly 90 seconds, all 4 modifications, the mine screen, angled bar armor, mud skid, and low gun mount were used, and each worked exactly as designed. When they cleared the ambush zone, ATC-12's armor was dented, the mesh torn, the mud skid glowing hot, but it still held its pull. Hale looked back at the dark stretch of water and wrote a brief line, countermeasure phase 1, successful. Wait for their next adaptation. And that was when the Riverine force recognized a new principle. The 3 traditional threats of the creek mud traps, bottom charges and waterline launcher shots, had failed. The next afternoon, inside an A-frame bunker by the creek bank, 4 men of Company 307 reviewed what they had pulled from the water: pieces of steel cable mesh, scorched curved armor, a wide swirl of disturbed mud, and 2 long slide marks from the mud skid. Every detail showed that ATC-12 had pushed through the entire trap system they'd set the day before. Bay then gave his conclusion quickly, his voice steady like he was reading a report. A single-layer mud trap no longer works. Dig a 2-layer pit. Waterline launcher shots get deflected downward, fire from higher ground. Bottom tripwires get swept and trigger early. Raise them 40-60 meters. Don't target the lead boat. Switch to delay trigger charges aimed at the second in the line. The bunker was silent for a few seconds. They understood the enemy had upgraded overnight, and they would have to do the same. A liaison officer crawled into the bunker and handed Ba Ven a mud-soaked, quarter-folded dispatch. It was an urgent report from the Coup 8 intelligence section. It stated plainly, U.S. forces on Route 44A are capable of altering armor overnight. Some ATCs equipped with tripwire sweeping nets, angled blast deflecting armor, and bottom skids against mud traps. Do not use single-layer pits. Do not fire at the waterline. The final line marked in red. This unit is no longer as easy to strike as last week. Ba Ven folded the paper without expression, but the whole team understood the seriousness. At the RAS-11 floating workshop, Hale ran his hand over the dent on ATC-12's armor. The blast angle had changed no longer, coming from a low water shot. The mine screen was torn nearly half a meter higher, exactly where the tripwire had been raised. The mud skid showed 2 deep compression marks, confirming a 2-layer pit. Hale concluded the enemy was matching their changes step for step on the same nightly cycle. He opened his notebook and wrote new entries: raise blast points, bypass, double layer, mud, high angle deflection armor, expect wave delay charges. Each line was another step in a race neither side could stop. The water still hides the clues, Hale thought, but the evidence shows they're catching up to us. That night, in a Melaleuca thicket half a kilometer from the creek, a guerrilla scout pressed a bamboo tube to the water to listen. Hammer blows and welding sparks echoed from the floating workshop. Short, sharp, constant. He whispered to the ambush team behind him, "The Americans are fixing their armor again. The mud pit can't hold them anymore. If that ATC makes it through 2 layers tomorrow, we'll have to abandon this stretch." No one replied. It was the first time they had to consider the possibility that the Americans might be adapting faster than they were. RAS-11 floating. Workshop. 1840. Weak yellow lights reflected off the creek, black as burned steel. Hale stepped onto ATC-12's deck, notebook in hand, with 4 new entries. 2-layer mine screen, overhead shield. Extended mud skid, bypass rudder. The technical crew stood in a half circle, exhausted but ready. Hale kept it short. They had 10 hours, and they had to adapt faster than the other side. 1. 2-layer mine screen. The tripwires had been raised so the old screen could only sweep the bottom. Hale used a 105mm gun brace as a vertical post and hung a second mesh at 40-60 centimeters below the surface. The lower layer swept the bottom, the upper layer caught the wires. Monitor crew hauled scorched steel cable onto the deck, and Luke welded the support frame. Half an hour later, a rough but solid 2-tier screen stood in place. 2. Overhead shield, high-angle protection. Hale took 2 curved armor plates from a burnt-out ATC and set them as a 45-degree roof. Fox shaped the metal with a hammer, while Luke welded the braces. The gold deflect high-angle launcher shot sideways instead of letting them punch into the cabin. 3. Extended mud skid. The mud pit had been dug into 2 layers, and the old skid wouldn't cover it. Hale and Fox studied the slide marks on the previous skid to locate the sinking points, then built a new one twice as large, shielding only the 2 danger zones. The hammering under the hull sounded like a metallic heartbeat. 4. Bypass, rudder, shallow water, steering. To prevent the main rudder from being sucked into mud or snagged on mangrove roots, Hale had a smaller auxiliary rudder welded on for shallow water. It was mounted with a large door hinge from a monitor. When they tested it, the sharp cook was enough to know it would bite the water. At 2 in the morning, ATC-12 sat motionless in the floating workshop, bent patched everywhere but stronger than the day before. Mercer looked around and sighed, knowing none of it met any standard. Hale simply answered that they weren't building to standard, they were building something that could survive this creek. He wrote the final line in his notebook, Countermeasure Phase 2, complete. Outside, the water lay black as a trap, but this time, ATC-12 would not enter it unarmed. Auto 5:31 a.m. The western branch of the Vàm Cỏ Đông lay under a layer of mist thick as cold ash. The Riverine column entered the sector suspected of having a new ambush site. The monitor broke the water up front, and ATC-12 followed behind its patched hull, looking like a steel-scarred creature sewn back together. Hale stood at the bow hand, resting on the newly built 2-layer mine screen. Mercer reported that scouts had heard digging. During the night, a clear sign the other side had changed its setup. The entire formation moved quietly into the bend. Suddenly, the upper layer of the mesh jerked hard. Hale knew instantly raised tripwires. Two near-simultaneous blasts, one high, one at water level, detonated just ahead of the bull. But with the dual screen in place, the blast washed downward into the mud, leaving ATC-12 shaken but intact. Before the shockwave faded, the creek bed ahead churned the first mud layer. The extended mud skid dropped, sliding the ATC sideways across the trap like skimming across a pond. Then the water collapsed again, the second mud layer, exactly as Hale predicted. The skid held its depth, the hull lifted, and the boat pushed through. Moments later, a firing slit opened in an elevated position about a meter above the waterline. A launcher round came down at a perfect angle to punch through the deck. The overhead shield snapped up at 45 degrees, taking the full hit. The blast washed off to the side like a steel fan blade. Automatic bursts rained down from the opposite bank. The gunner raised the new high-angle mount, and the M60 shredded the crest of the emplacement. The monitors surged forward, pulling the entire formation out of the kill zone. The two PBRs closed flank to clear the path. It all happened in 90 seconds, and all four new systems, the two-layer minescreen extended mud skid overhead shield and high gun mount, performed exactly as Hale had calculated. When they reached open water, ATC-12 was dented and scorched, but still holding. Mercer said only one quiet line, that today Hale had kept the boat and the entire creek open. That same afternoon, a document captured from a local battalion staff officer in Koo, 8 read ATC-12 passed through our ambush site like water sliding off a lotus leaf. High-set mines detonated early. Downslope launcher shots were deflected. The two-layer mud trap also failed. The report concluded, there is no longer any guaranteed kill point on Route 44A. We must change our entire method. In river jungle warfare, the pattern repeated. The enemy changed tactics, still got bypassed, forced to change again, and eventually lost strategic confidence. 3 days later, the mobile Riverine force added a new entry to its internal documentation, Riverine Countermeasures, Field Expedient Solutions. ATC-12 was pulled back to the dock, its hull lined with metal scars, but still fully operational because what Hale and the technical team built had become the new rules of the fight. 72 hours after the canal crossing Long and Sector headquarters recorded, Route 44A fully reopened with no further ambushes. Civilian boats floating markets and supply craft could move again after nearly a week of shutdown. A forward position of local opposing forces on the West Bank had to be abandoned as ATCs could now approach from the water, a direction previously assumed to be safe. American intelligence also noted a major shift. The opposing 5th Division redirected operations to secondary routes, avoiding 44A, entirely assessing that the modified ATCs were no longer hindered by mud traps or bottom charges. In the Mobile Riverine Forces Consolidated Report, the remarks section was underlined. The tactical performance of ATC-12 has produced a sector-wide change. Operational level effects are now visible. At MRF command, ATC-12's breakthrough triggered changes far beyond a single convoy. Follow-up reports forced Riverine Command to revise the entire convoy structure, mandatory mine screens for lead boats, expanded authority for on-site technical chiefs, and approval for in-theater repairs and modifications without waiting for rear base authorization. A new standard also emerged. Every ATC operating in murky water had to be equipped for multi-layer mud protection, bottom charge defense, and high-angle blast deflection. It was the first time in the campaign that a set of improvised overnight field modifications became the official procedure for the entire force. At the strategic level, MRF reached a defining conclusion. In a creek water battlefield, the unit that survives isn't the strongest, it's the one that can change the fastest. And from that moment on, every Riverine plan had to assume the enemy would adapt, and that they would have to adapt faster still.